All right, we begin tonight back in the midpoint of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 32 is where we kind of left off, um, which was kind of a shame. I wanted to do all this in one go, 30 to 33, but to kind of refresh where we were, this is the midpoint of Jeremiah, if not numerically, but thematically, because it's in this section between 30 and 33 that he hits this center point of mercy and grace. And we left off finishing 31 where he establishes this mindset of this new covenant, and you can read it there in the last 10 verses of chapter 31. That he wants to establish this new covenant where he would write the law on their hearts. And then it goes into chapters 32 and 33 where it's a continuation of this idea of mercy and grace, and it's this promise of mercy. And you see that on the screens, I know, but there's this promise of mercy. And there's this illustration you find in the beginning of verse 30, in beginning of chapter 32, where Jeremiah buys a field per God's direction. And it was this idea of he's buying this field even though exile is imminent, because when he bought this field, God said, it will be maintained unto you. It's a showcase of mercy that despite the exile, there will always be a land, there will always be a place for God's people. And God promises that the people would one day return also in chapter 32. So just these chapters here, 32, 33, are filled with the promises of God that he would never forget them, he would never leave them, that there would be a return, that there would be a restoration. And like I said, 32 talks about that more. It talks about the Davidic covenant, and there's some beautiful words written through there, some words of poetry that you can see. I was grateful for Brother Justin over the weekend with our conference, breaking down how many different writing styles are found in our scriptures, whether it's narrative, whether it's like legal law code, or whether it's poetry and prose. And sometimes they're mixed together, or one inside of another. And like I said, you can find some beautiful words within the book of Jeremiah. And that's this major unit 4. Like I said, this is the midpoint of Jeremiah. It's these prophecies of comfort, and like I said, mercy, restoration, renewal, that God will not leave. He will not forsake those people. He will not let them pass without his heart being over them. But as we leave this section and get into this next unit, the fall of Jerusalem, it starts with chapter 34, going back kind of to the content that we were used to in the book of Jeremiah. It speaks about the broken covenant of Jerusalem in chapter 34, how that they, again, failed to uphold their duties, that the king would die in exile. That king specifically is Zedekiah, the king of Judah, that they would die in the exile, but the Lord would not forsake his people forever. However, as this chapter ends, I want to read verse 21 through the end of the chapter there, 22. It says, Zedekiah, king of Judah, and his officials I will give into the hand of their enemies, and into the hand of those that seek their life, and into the hand of the king of Babylon. I will command, says the Lord, and cause them to return to the city, and they will fight against it, and take it and burn it with fire. And I will make the cities of Judah a desolation without inhabitation. And that was the future of Jerusalem in Judah, and that was the future of King Zedekiah, that they, because of their broken covenant, would be removed or destroyed. Then it comes into this interesting section. Chapter 35 is about the obedience of the, and I'm going to mispronounce this, I'm sure, Rechabites, Rechabites. Call it, pronounce it how you choose to. But the Rechabites, it just shifts. It goes from the disobedience of Judah and Jerusalem into this notion. I'm not going to be able to pull that up. Yeah. It goes into this notion, or this entire account about how they were faithful, how they were obedient, which was a complete comparison to everything else that was going on around them. That they're throughout this entire book, had been so much disobedience. There had been so much um, antagonizing of the Lord. Yet in this moment, it's like, oh, but wait, there was this group, there was these people who they obeyed the Lord, and there was blessings that would come on them. Again, you see the end of this chapter, and you can kind of get the conclusion. Therefore, says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Jonadab, the son of Rechab, shall not lack a man to stand before me always. And that's one of those promises that we heard akin to David. And the house of David will reign forever. And here he says at the end of it, the lineage of Rechab will stand before me forever. That there will always be a lineage of the Rechabites, which is a complete opposition to what we were seeing in some of these other places, that these lineages would be completely destroyed. Yet here he says this lineage will be preserved forever. And you know, it's to me, it's just interesting that they stood out.
Where are these Rechabites from?
That's what I was trying to pull up so I can answer that question. No, you're good. I was planning for this, right? The Rechabites in Jeremiah were a nomadic clan in ancient Israel who descended from Jonadab, the son of Rechab. They are presented as a model of faithfulness and obedience in contrast to the people of Judah. Their ancestor was a prominent figure during the time of King Jehu. And if you want to see that, you can go back to 2 Kings chapter 10, where he supported Jehu while King Jehu went on his eradication of Baal throughout Israel. So there's not one specific origin, but we see him associated with righteousness with King Jehu. They followed the commands of the Lord. They did not give in to the drunkenness of wine. They stood out against, like I said, the apostasy of the rest of Israel and Judah. But they don't have, because I was like, is this going back to I wanted to find like some caveat where it's like, oh, it ties back to like the lineage of Christ. And not that I was, because we know the lineage of Christ, but like, were they kin by brotherhood, or like, was it like one of,
It'd be tied to one of the tribes or something.
right? And no, it just says like they were a descendant of they were a descendant of a righteous man who supported King Jehu. Like I said, 2 Kings 10, 15 through 25, round about there, speaks of how Jonadab was a supporter of King Jehu. But we've seen this before. We've seen non-Israelite people groups become more obedient in the state of Israel than Israel itself. We saw that when Joshua was conquering the land with the Gibeonites, who were like, we don't want to be destroyed, so we're going to pretend to be broken, poor, and from far away, just so that we can gain the favor of Israel and gain their protection. And sure enough, that's what happened. Even though they tricked Israel, Israel honored their agreement, and they served the Lord. But yeah, when I came across this, I was like, I want to know this answer and have it ready, because I want to be able to give that answer. And it's great that even though I looked it up, the answer still, I don't fully know. So there's that. But it just highlights their obedience despite their origin that we don't fully know. But
Did you say that they were related to the Midianites?
no, if I did, I didn't intend to.
Well, that Got question says that the Rechabites were descendants of Rechab, a Kenite, and thus related to the Midianites and Moses' family by marriage.
Well, that would check out. Okay.
As a reference for Judges 1:16.
Can you pull that up?
Judges 1:16?
Yeah. The children of Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up out of the city of palm trees with the children of Judah, the wilderness Judah, which lies in. Yeah, that cleared that up. I'm not doubting you, but it's just like I don't know what I was expecting from that verse.
It's saying that Rechab, from which they get their name,
Yeah.
was a Kenite,
Okay. Which is, yeah.
which is Moses'
Yeah.
father-in-law.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you have it. And for those on the recording, just to make sure you did hear it, the research that Brother Joel did said that Rechab was a Kenite, which was related to Moses' father-in-law.
And if that's wrong, just real quick, tell them that's from Got Questions.
Yeah, that is not. That was something we found on the internet, so trust that as far as the internet can trust it. We can get into the sureties of what happens next. It's another cycle. If y'all remember before, Jeremiah had this cycle where he would give prophecy, he would preach, and then he would either weep or something bad would happen to him. Guess what? It picks back up again because in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, remember, very bad king, son of Josiah, which was a really good king, king of Judah, the word came from Jeremiah, or to Jeremiah from the Lord, and he wrote this scroll to kind of begin the summary. He wrote the scroll, delivered it to the king, and the king used it for fireplace fuel. He literally would rip it up and throw it in the fire. And, well, they rewrote the scroll again because they were persistent, but it didn't go well for Jeremiah. He began to warn Zedekiah, king of Judah, because Jehoiakim was king of Israel. He began to warn Zedekiah, king of Judah, and he was punished for it. He was thrown in prison, into a cistern, and even though all this bad was happening to him, he was being arrested and imprisoned. He continued to warn the kings of the oncoming destruction if they would not repent. So it's beautiful to see that despite him warning the kings and the negative happening to him being imprisoned, he never wavered. He continued to warn Zedekiah again, and we see that halfway through 38. He begins to warn them again to no prevail, but he never forsook that. And my mind is drawn to Joseph when he was cast into the hole, when he was cast into prison. He never forsook the Lord either, and Jeremiah did so here. He continued to issue warning. He continued to issue prophecy. He continued to speak on what we find happening in chapters 39, 40, and 41, which is aptly titled The Fall of Jerusalem. The Lord finally has enough, and in the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and I heard a man pronounce that probably more correctly the other day, and I wish I would remembered how he said it. But Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, all of his army came against Jerusalem, besieged it, and in the 11th year, so notice 2 years, in the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 4th month, year and a half, the 9th day of the month, the city wall was broken up, and all the officials of the king of Babylon entered and sat at the middle gate. Nebuchadnezzar, I should have brought that to y'all. Nergal-Sharezer, Shamgar-Nebo, his officials, and the rest of the officials of the king of Babylon. I'm not going to try to keep pronouncing those incorrectly. He brought those before him, and they overtook the land, in short. And what I got, I wish I would have had, and I forgot it got brought up here. There was something recently in archaeology they found relating to one of these officials, like a seal or a representation of him somewhere recently. Brother Danny shared it recently, and I forgot it was here. And maybe next week I'll remember to have it. It's just more cool stuff that we find popping up out of the dirt, at least in my opinion. But here we see the fall of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar fully takes over. Took a year and a half, but they got there. The Lord delivers Jeremiah, though, in the midst of it. He kept his promise to Jeremiah, never letting him be taken and forsaken. But these few chapters here, 39, 40, and 41, began to detail this, what happens, and then, and to me, an odd turn. In 42, we see some brilliant folks say, hey, you know what we need to do? We need to go take refuge in Egypt. Now, they did that once and it worked. But we know what the outcome of that was. 400 years of slavery. Well, not 400, but the years of slavery. They said, let's do it again, but they had already been told, which we've studied remotely, multiple times, that they were not to have any relation with Egypt. Yet here they go, let's go take safety in the shadow of Egypt. Jeremiah warns against it, but can you believe what they do? They did it anyway. Yep. And chapter 42 through 45 is this saga about what happens. They go to Egypt. They end up back in idolatry. Shocker. And God punishes them for what they do. There's calamity. I like that word being used here. And there was eventual judgment, which is where we pick up in the sixth major unit, where it shifts away from prophecies against Judah and Israel and begins this litany of prophecies against other nations. And coming out of the saga where Jeremiah was like, don't do anything with Egypt, leave them alone, don't trust them, don't seek them for protection. Y'all did it anyway. Why don't y'all listen? Here's prophecies of judgment on Egypt. And that's what starts in chapter 46. And you'll see throughout these next few chapters just these different judgments that are being cast out against all these other nations. They'll be on the screens. I'll try to go slow, even though I'm going to cover them kind of quickly. You have the Egyptians in chapter 46, the Philistines in chapter 47, Moab and the Moabites in chapter 48. And then 49, it just goes through several. And I'm not going to list them all. You can literally see on the screen here in a second. It's just nearby nations. A lot of surrounding nations were called into judgment in chapter 49. And if you want to read which ones specifically, you can go through. But I can rattle off some. Ammon, Edom, and others. And so he just talks about how they were a part of the grand problem. Damascus and Syria as well was another one. And they were going to be judged too for their actions for or against the people of Israel. And let me help you. It's going to be mostly against. Chapter 50, Babylon. Chapter 51 contains the destruction of Babylon. And I went through these chapters a whole lot faster. That's why I wanted to get to a different spot last week. Chapter 50 is the prophecies against Babylon, which remember are the ones that just went and conquered Judah and Jerusalem. Now here's judgments prophesied against Babylon. Well, you don't have to wait for very long to see what happens with that, because in chapter 51 is the fulfillment, the destruction of Babylon. How that was going to come to pass, what that would look like, right? So there may have been some metaphor in 50, but 51 made it pretty clear, like, this is what's going to happen. And then we're going to stop, because we're running out of books or chapters here. It was chapter 52. It's the last chapter, and we're just going to kind of go through this in its small sections here. But chapter 52, like we've mentioned, is the last chapter, and it's Jeremiah's final lament in this book. This is what I titled the epilogue of Jeremiah, but it's more than just that, because he talks about the final heartbreaking things that he sees. Because he begins chapter 52 by reviewing the fall of Jerusalem. He said Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Amital, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah, and he puts in that detail. But he says, he did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord, which is the phrase that's used against every evil king. He did that which was evil in the eyes of the Lord, not the people. It sets it apart, saying he wasn't unholy against the people, he was unholy against the Lord. He did that which was evil in the sight of the eyes of the Lord. And note, through the anger of the Lord, this came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah. He's not saying, and this is important, he's not saying through the strength of Babylon. Babylon didn't do this because they were so big and bad. He said, through the anger of the Lord, this came to pass. That's denoted that Babylon would have forever been held at bay, but because the Lord had his righteous anger towards the people of Judah, this came to pass. That's because those nations that conquered were like, well, yeah, we did this. Jeremiah saying, no, you didn't. You wouldn't have had the Lord not let you. You never would have penetrated the walls of Judah. You never would have set foot in the throne had the Lord not let you. But because of his anger, this happened. That Jerusalem and Judah, until he had cast them out from his presence. Then Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And in the ninth year of his reign, in the 10th month, and the 10th day, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and his army, against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. They built a siege wall around it so that the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And in the 4th month, 9th day of the month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no bread for the people of the land. Then the city was breached, and all the men of war fled and went out of the city by night by way of the gate between the two walls, which was by the king's garden through the child. It keeps going. It details how that the Babylonians essentially just waited. They surrounded Jerusalem and attacked it, yeah. But their strategy was, if they can't get out and no one can get in, all we have to do is wait. Because we can get provisions from outside, they can't. And if they're constantly trying to defend against us, they've got no time to farm. They've got no time to raise crops. They'll eventually have to just surrender. And if you are a fan of the history of war, you'll see it as a recognizable tactic. They just starved them out until, as it said there, all the men of war ran. And then you see what happened to the king there. It says they took the king, carried him away, carried him up to the king of Babylon, where he passed sentence on him. The king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah. Because remember, Zedekiah rebelled against him, so he said, this will never happen again because there will be no one to follow you. So he slew the sons of Zedekiah, and also he also slew all of the officials of Judah there in Riblah. Then he put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and the king of Babylon bound him in chains and carried him to Babylon and put him in prison until the day of his death. So that was a permanent end to Zedekiah and his descendancy. Now in the 5th month, in the 10th day of the month, when the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard who served the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and the houses of Jerusalem. Even all the large houses he burned with fire, and the army of the Chaldeans, who were the captain of the guard, broke down the walls of Jerusalem all around it. This is important because it sets up something that happens later on in our scriptures with Ezra and Nehemiah. They're detailing here, as Jeremiah is detailing, he said, this is what happened when Jerusalem was taken in the 580s. They razed the place. They destroyed it, which I think it's funny that razed nowadays the opposite meaning, but they leveled it. And they burned the city. They destroyed the walls. Not only was there a place for God to be, but there was no protection for they removed every sense of protection. They took out their temples, then took out their walls. So then they defeated the people, but then kept them defeated by removing everything that gave them hope or safety or security. I'm trying to find where I want to pick up. The captain, in verse 24, the captain of the guard took Sariah, the chief priest, and Zephaniah, the second priest, and 3 officers of the temple. He took them out of the city, 1 officer who had charge of the men of war, and 7 men of the visors. He keeps going. The king of Babylon struck them and put them to death in Riblah and the land of Hamath. Thus Judah was carried away captive out of its own land. And these are the people whom Nebuchadnezzar carried away captive. In the 7th year, 3,023 Jews. In the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, he carried away captive from Jerusalem 832 persons. In the 23rd year, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive of the Jews 745. All the persons were 4,600. And so that tells you how many were carried away, so that when they come back, the record keeping is immaculate. That they knew who was lost, they knew who was killed, they knew who was carried away, and they knew who came back. Because we do know there was a return. And then we have Jeremiah end. in a very interesting way. Not a unique way, but an interesting way. Because in a very familiar passage, we see it say here, in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah. So it maintains Jehoiachin's reign, but keeps that as just a landmark. In the 37th year of his reign, in the 12th month, on the 25th day of the month. What? Yeah, but we know that comparison. That's when, like, not his reign. You're right, but of the captivity. But it keeps him as this landmark about when to gauge when things happened. Yeah, you're right. I didn't mean to say reign. It was captivity. But we know when he came king. We know when he was king, when they were carried away, and it uses him as a landmark to keep this measure of time. It says in that time, Awel Marduk, king of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, lifted up the head of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and brought him out of prison, and spoke kindly to him, and set his throne above the throne of the kings who were with him in Babylon. Therefore Jehoiachin changed his prison garments, and continually ate meals before him all the days of his life. For his allowance, there was a continual allowance given to him by the king of Babylon every day, a portion, all the days of his life until the day of his death. We've seen this before. We've talked about this before. This is how the book of Kings ended. The same exact way. He was taken out of prison. He was put on a throne, and he was given this position the rest of his days. We talked about how this was very symbolic to Joseph, who we already mentioned tonight, how Joseph was taken out of prison and given a throne next to the king all the days of his life. This was so intentionally written. Jeremiah was a book filled with very negative things. There's doom, there's destruction, there's agony, there's captivity, there's exile. All these things are coming to Jerusalem, to Judea, or to Judah, to Israel, to all these surrounding nations, Egypt, Sodom, not Sodom, but Edom, Syria. I combined Syria and Edom to make Sodom, and I knew that was wrong. But all these surrounding nations, they were all going to be judged. There was going to be all this destruction. There was going to be all this upheaval. In the middle of the book, which is where the center of the focus is, there's hope. There's this figure coming. There's restoration coming. There's renewal coming. And by the end of the book, he goes, I want to remind you, just as we've already heard, like Joseph, the Lord can raise, even seemingly from the dead, a king of hope. And like with Joseph, who was in prison, dead to his family, raised out of that pit to be a king, raised out of death, which is where his family thought he was, to be set as a king. Here he's saying, from the captivity, from this death of a nation, the king is set upon the throne, that from death a king will come, that despite the situation, there will be this hope. Jeremiah ends it in the same fashion like I said the book of Kings does, and sets this beautiful imagery of hope at the very end. Any question or comment on Jeremiah?